English translation Hatred Makes the Human Beings Inhuman by Billy Edward Albert Meier.
The opposite of true love is hate. And this very often makes human beings murderers, and has done so since time immemorial. For hate is as old as humanity itself. The fundamental causes of hate are so diverse that they cannot be listed in their entirety, for the triggers are purely psychological and conscious in nature, and are based on a wide range of factors. These, in turn, are based on causes that arise from the fact that the human being is neglected, disregarded, or rejected, both in terms of love, requests and cries for help, etc. Also racial hatred, poverty, misery, need, ridicule, loss, xenophobia, violence and coercion, of every conceivable kind, radical religious or sectarian delusion, etc., are fundamental, but also cruelty, weakness, fear of the future, horror, war, and other films that glorify violence, torture, torment, and murder. Even disparaging, or simply observing glances, remarks, teasing, a slap in the face, verbal abuse, insults, jokes, bad marks and assessments, taunts, poisoned words, gossip, or world events, etc., can become the actual cause of hatred. Punishment, desires, wishes, frustration, offence, coldness, heat, contempt, disadvantage, jealousy, torment, cunners, weather, humiliation, being beaten, strict and all-powerful obedience, discipline and order, suppression, bullying, that is to say, mobbing, as well as all kinds of fears, such as fear of losing power in one's own territory, etc., are enough to spark hatred. All these factors lead to the human being, who is being harassed, becoming an outsider, feeling rejected, and sinking into boundless hatred. Any feelings of love are completely killed off by the influences that exclude human beings, leaving all might to the bottomless hatred, which gradually increases to a pathological delusion that is no longer accessible to reason or understanding. The forms of hatred are extremely diverse, and can be directed against children, women, girls, boys, or men, governments, authorities, the military, people of different faiths, and the wealthy, but also against those human beings who live in peace, in love, in partnership, friendship, or family, who live in the neighborhood, or who have a good job. The basic causes of hatred are therefore countless, although it is usually also accompanied by boundless rage, and often also despair, from which there is no escape. Every human being who sinks into hatred sees the real world as something that he has to oppose, far removed from any compassion for fellow human beings, and also often in relation to the world of flora and fauna. In many cases, hatred is associated with the desire to see other human beings and animals suffer, whereby the haters perceive thoughts and feelings of satisfaction, joy, and gratification within themselves. Many human beings, who give free rein to their hatred in an extreme wise, find the real world boring, which is why they become quarrelsome, unconsciously suppress their reason in their hatred, and commit destructive or murderous acts. For every human being affected by it, hatred means that they are waging a personal and bitter war, because they have created an extreme enemy image in themselves, against one or more other people, against some things or other which they absolutely have to destroy. Thus, for the human being affected by it, living out hatred becomes a life task. Hatred is a destructive force created by the human being himself, in the form of a psychotic illness. In this state, he buries everything in his psyche and consciousness under an abyss of rage, love, peace, freedom and harmony, joy, compassion for himself and his fellow human beings, hope and confidence, etc. But exactly the opposite is necessary to lead a life that is dignified and also fulfilling. So, it is necessary for the human being who has fallen prey to hatred to reawaken compassion in himself, both for himself and for his fellow human beings and the whole environment. And this is absolutely necessary, because hatred, like love, is an enormous human energy. While true love, if it does not degenerate, knows no bounds of good and best, and realizes everything in this sense, hatred is an immensely strong destroyer of the worst kind, dominating human beings. Hatred is the opponent of love and compassion, and a human being who has fallen prey to hatred can only exist for himself, because there can be no coexistence with love, compassion, peace, freedom, harmony, equality, and equal rights. If the mentally weak and unstable human being who does not self-confidently follow the natural creational laws and recommendations, and is not grounded in them, is attacked, humiliated, and suppressed in any wise, then these factors will prevail and destroy compassion. Only a human being who is firmly grounded in the natural laws and commandments of the creation is able to successfully resist the destruction of compassion and the emergence of hatred, while the mentally unstable and weak undergo all variations of moral decline, loss of reason and logic, as well as compassion, and fall prey to hatred. Emotional and mental impulses are automatically killed off, so that even pain and anger are overlaid by hatred and no longer perceived. Thus, through bottomless hatred, emotional and mental impulses are completely choked off, so that no control can be exercised over them. The initial occurrence of pain and anger as a result of humiliation, torment, teasing, verbal abuse, insults and discrimination, etc., ultimately sweep the unstable and weak human being completely empty inside, like a tremendous storm that tears everything away, destroys, and annihilates. Swept clean inside, the human being falls prey to the lack of rational thoughts and feelings, and thus inevitably to the predominance of hatred, and this is because he is dead, in a rational way, in terms of intellectual and emotional impulses, and cut off from his own suffering. Consequently, thoughts and feelings of reason and logic no longer prevail, but only uncontrollable emotions, which, in the worst case, leads to other human beings being killed, harassed without limit, tortured and tormented in this state of emotional hatred, because the person living in bottomless hatred is only able to feel something like life in himself in this way. And the fundamental truth about the human being who has allowed hatred to arise within him and also to act it out is that he fundamentally hates himself, but he shifts his hatred outwards against fellow human beings, against the government, the authorities, the state, the flora and fauna, etc., all the negative things that affect a mentally unstable and weak human being in any way have psychological, cognitive, and neurological effects on them that cannot be assessed in any way. Depending on how unstable and weak the human being is, his emotional impulses can be aroused in relation to hatred, which can befall anyone who is unstable and weak, without exception, if the appropriate and traumatizing means have an effect on him. As a rule, mentally unstable and weak human beings are unable to cope with their traumatic experiences and the way they are experienced. As a result, the psyche dissociates, separates, or splits off these experiences. This then corresponds to a pathological development process, in the course of which associated thought, feeling, and behavioral processes break down into largely uncontrolled parts and individual phenomena. To a large extent, it can also lead to disturbances in the orderly interaction of muscles, nerves, and organs. Basically, this corresponds to a protective reaction of the brain, in the sense that it enables the survival of extreme injuries. However, the effect of this is that two different parts of the personality develop in the human being, which then continue to develop separately. On the one hand, there is the human side, and on the other, the inhuman, that is to say, the good and the evil, love and hate. Both sides are equipped with thought and feeling patterns, as well as with behavioral patterns that are firmly anchored in the brain. Basically, it then only depends on the situation in question which of the two personality traits becomes active and dominant and controls behavior. However, in the case of boundless and limitless hatred, the rule is that only this part of the personality is constantly in control. Human beings who act out their hatred on defenseless fellow human beings, on flora or fauna, or in any other way, have often themselves been mistreated, humiliated, disadvantaged, tormented, or otherwise harmed, which can never be an excuse for their hatred and hateful actions. It is also a fact that even the greatest and most profound hatred of a human being can be neutralized again if the willful prerequisite for this is given. In fact, there is a way to treat hatred, for example, by showing the person affected by hatred honest love and compassion, or by showing or playing scenes that evoke psychological pain, compassion, or sadness in him, and initiate a release from hatred. In this wise, it is possible for a person who is afflicted by hatred to be awakened to his healthy, rational, and positive thoughts and feelings, and thus also to compassion. Normally, and ideally, human beings are taught about the creational natural laws and recommendations through the education they receive from their parents, etc., and thus become strong, stable, and self-confident individuals who learn to develop complex strategies for coping with life in order to assert themselves and solve unavoidable conflicts. These abilities are stored in the cerebral cortex, which strengthens certain instinctive defense programs in the depths of the brain when negative, bad or evil factors appear, such as fear, rejection, brutality, or torment, etc. These defense programs are of an archaic nature, that is to say, belong to the early days of human beings, and are geared towards attack, paralysis, and flight. They have therefore been anchored in human beings since the dawn of time, and are controlled by the oldest part of the brain, namely the brainstem. However, these defense programs can be consciously controlled by human beings, if they make a conscious effort to control them, and if they are able to balance them out, even when constant frustrations lead to growing aggression, which acts like petrol when poured onto a fire, and is a real explosive of hatred. And if these defense programs and the aggressions are not controlled in the best way, then the human being falls prey to hatred, which then serves to gain control and might over fellow human beings, or over other things, as well as over situations, etc. A cascade of violence, arising from hatred, built up uncontrollably in a human being in seconds or in just under a minute, after which violence of some kind is exercised, full of hatred. Such an act of violence is not based on an impulsive act, more on brutality in the heat of the moment, because the hate-filled human being is simply ready to use violence. So the floodgates for hatred are constantly open. However, this already corresponds to an addiction that acts as a brain-substantial drug and uninhibitedly increases the feeling of power over fellow human beings, things and situations, etc. The brain of a human being who has built up hatred within himself is constantly programmed for aggression, whereby the open violent outbreak of the same is unpredictable and can be based on extremely trivial and tiny things. If the pent-up aggression breaks out, and everything happens very quickly from the cerebral cortex, with conscious reflective control over the action disappearing at a tremendous speed. The cerebral cortex is practically blocked, so no more stimuli for action reach it, but everything reaches the brainstem at a tremendous speed, which is the actual starting point of the aggression. A gigantic wave of nerve messenger substances then races into the amygdala, that is to say, the almond nucleus, located in the core area of the cerebrum, and floods. This factor, a gateway for memories and mental and emotional impulses that are scanned according to very specific criteria for fears, dislikes, and hatred. The result is agitation and restlessness, sweating and weak knees, and the brain reports a threat where there is none. All control mechanisms are suspended, and a state of intoxication is created, from which reward cascades appear, which correspond to an addiction just as much as the abusive consumption of alcohol, drugs, medication, sports, food and sex, etc. In this wise, human beings mutate into violent monsters, whereby the addictive hormone dopamine plays a decisive role, which also leads to individuals who have fallen prey to hatred, stimulating their reward system in the head by deliberately seeking confrontation and giving their aggressions free rein. Other triggers of hatred are bondage, the power to command, and blind faith in authority, whereby responsibility for one's actions, or for everything and anything, is not borne by oneself, but is passed on to third parties. Another reason is to see other human beings, as well as official bodies, objects and things of all kinds, situations or events, as enemies. And it is indeed true that human beings program their brains to hate, either through their own actions or through the influence of fellow human beings, or through some external influence. In any case, the human being creates the hatred within himself, out of his own volition, even if he is terrorized from the outside, for example, through whispering coercion, humiliation, or education, etc., which is only possible if he is mentally unstable and weak. In order to let hatred arise in himself, the human being must overcome the inhibition mechanisms located in the cerebrum, which is the case in a very short time, in mentally unstable and weak people, due to constant training. And when the inhibitions are overcome, the fear of dying and of death also disappears. And this, in turn, programs the aggressive defense reflexes and the violence. The complex ability to feel compassion for one's neighbor, fellow human beings, and everything and everyone else disappears as a result of the instinctive seething energy of hatred. The hatred leads to blind rage that destroys everything that the human being has painstakingly worked for and created. The fine structures of the nerve pathways are overrun by the archaic power of aversion, as is social far-sighted behavior. The smallest and most trivial incidents and situations, etc., are discharged in anger, unchecked, into aggression and rage, completely alienated from the reality of existence, and to such an extent that fellow human beings, etc., tend to be seen only as enemies, corresponding to the general development. In the best case, other human beings are simply insulted as idiots, especially when their asocial behavior is blamed on their hatred. And this is precisely what proves that a great many human beings are affected by hatred, at least to a small extent, albeit in a small way, that does not lead to violence or other serious aggression, but which nevertheless testifies to the fact that a paranoid fantasy as well as thoughts and feelings of hatred are at work within them. Hatred also leads to revenge and retaliation, whereby the driving forces of the latter often also come to the fore in sadistic force. This happens especially because hatred triggers enormous stress reactions in the body, which in connection with negative thoughts and feelings, as well as the resulting aggressions, consume enormous amounts of energy. The effect of this is that a physical, mental, and overall mental exhaustion occurs, which in turn leads to new frustration, new anger, and an increase in hatred and aggression. The result is that once hatred is created and breaks out, it takes over and dominates everything in its might. A neurological pendulum in the area of a relatively small but significant nucleus in the diencephalon The hypothalamus also plays an important role. This reacts to a certain stress hormone, but conversely also releases large amounts of the stress hormone cortisol. And this happens when a human being is under pressure and in a stressful situation. The inhibition threshold becomes lower, the more often anger, revenge, and offense, etc. provoke a feedback process. Everything is always situation dependent, and a question of time before a feedback reaction between the aggression center and the stress hormone occurs, causing the human being to lose control. And for this to happen, a tiny little conflict situation of some kind is enough. Interestingly, it can be observed that the small, minimal, or bottomless and boundless hatred in the head of a human being continues even if he does not notice anything of the whole, because hatred can also occur in an unwanted way and act from the hidden. Even unconscious perceptions of hated or otherwise unpopular human beings, objects, plants, items, animals, and things of all kinds, can cause uncontrolled reactions in the eyes, such as a narrowing of the iris. The pulse and blood pressure also change, and sweating and an increase in skin resistance can also be signs of hatred. But that is not all, because hatred can be contagious to mentally unstable and weak human beings, especially when they are under stress. However, it must be understood that stress hormones are not the actual triggers of hostility, but they contribute to it to a large extent. And the fact is that hateful and agitated human beings hold others responsible for their negative behavior and irritation in this regard, and also project their hatred and agitation onto their fellow human beings, so that negative emotions are simply transferred to the next person. Hatred and other aggressive tendencies of any kind can also have physiological causes, in particular, damage to the frontal lobe, which as the seat of impulse control, favors violence, which can also manifest itself as aggressive, physical violence. Damage to the frontal lobe can lead to uncontrollable outbursts of rage, which often result in fellow human beings, or the entire environment being maltreated. Violence also arises, among other things, from brain metabolism disorders, such as when the serotonin hormone level is too low. Furthermore, it is also the case that aggression and violence appear when there are pathological changes in the emotional center structures of the limbic system. The greatest evil of our time is the rapidly increasing violence and aggression in families, among adolescents, and in many people in general, although damaged brain structures have little to do with it. The fact is that all violence and aggression is learned, whether through the faulty upbringing of parents or other legal guardians, or through contact with socially misguided colleagues, friends and acquaintances, etc. So, aggression and violence are also acquired, learned and adopted, just like love, compassion, helpfulness, and humanity. The human being is not like animals and creatures, not even when he has instincts and drives within him, because he's fundamentally aware of himself, and is able to consciously use and control all his behavior, ideas, thoughts, and feelings, as well as his entire mental block. Certain behavioral traits, in relation to aggression and violence, cannot be inherited in the same way, because genes do not determine how the brain is to behave. In fact, they merely provide the possibility or potential which the human being must consciously use and shape. So it is up to the human being himself how he develops together with the guidelines provided by role models. Evil, hatred, and violence, as well as revenge, retaliation, and killing, are not innate to human beings. Rather, they learn these negative values, just as they also have to learn to control their impulses. So, everything is in the hands of human beings, including the strength with which they develop love or aggression, hate, revenge, or pace, freedom, joy, and harmony, and how they deal with frustration and disappointment, or with happiness and well-being. Billy Simyase Silver Star Center, December 18, 2008, 1840 HRS.